Joe An Unsung Hero, written by Ned Jensen. Introduction. Space exploration has many heroes. If you were asked to name a few, you might mention Yuri Gagarin, the first person to travel into space, or Neil Armstrong, the first person to walk on the moon. Or you might name Alan Shepard, John Glenn, or Sally Ride, all well-known American astronauts. But you probably would not include Joe Kittinger on your list. He is an unsung hero. However, many people regard Joe as a true pioneer of space exploration. Joe Kittinger was neither an ordinary space explorer nor an actual astronaut or cosmonaut. However, what Joe did probably took more courage than that of any astronaut who climbed into a space shuttle or capsule and rocketed into space. What did Joe do that was so extraordinary? Let's find out. Jumping Joe. Before humans were zooming into space in rocket-propelled capsules, Joe Kittinger was flying high-altitude balloons into the very edge of space. It was all part of a U.S. Air Force project called Project Manhigh. The project's purpose was to test what would happen to humans who spent a long time in conditions similar to those found in outer space. In June 1957, Joe made his first balloon flight into the stratosphere and reached an altitude of 29,565 meters, 97,000 feet. He was aloft for almost 7 hours. The information gathered from high-altitude balloon flights by Joe and others was invaluable to NASA's planning for the first human spaceflights. Later, Joe was the engineer for Project Excelsior, a U.S. Air Force project to develop safe ways to escape from high-altitude aircraft and spaceships. In August 1960, a year before Russian cosmonaut Yuri Gagarin became the first person considered to travel into space, Joe Kittinger accomplished an equally incredible feat. He rode in a balloon filled with helium gas to a distance of 31,333 meters, 102,800 feet above Earth. A typical passenger jet flies at about 9,144 meters, 30,000 feet above Earth. Joe went more than 3 times higher than passenger jets fly, in a balloon. Okay, so that's pretty incredible, isn't it? But get this. Next, Joe stepped out of the balloon. At 31,333 meters, 102,800 feet above Earth, he stepped out of the open gondola into the emptiness of space. He wasn't going for a spacewalk. Instead, he jumped out and began falling back to Earth. Do you know? Joe piloted 93 different types of aircraft that included planes and balloons. He flew 5,300 hours in jet plane flight and about 1,000 hours flying combat missions. He parachuted 101 times, with 3 of those jumps from balloons at very high altitude. Before we learn what happened to Joe, let's think about conditions at 31,333 meters, 102,800 feet above Earth. At that altitude, the air is very thin, which makes it next to impossible to inhale enough oxygen with each breath. Joe carried a supply of oxygen, which allowed him to breathe comfortably. However, it is also incredibly cold that high above Earth. At the 32-kilometer, 20-mile distance Joe traveled in his balloon, he was deep into a layer of the atmosphere called the stratosphere. This layer stretches from 9.5 to 48 kilometers, about 6 to 30 miles above Earth. So Joe was floating well into the stratosphere, where temperatures can be as low as minus 68 degrees Celsius, minus 90 degrees Fahrenheit. To keep himself warm in these hostile conditions, Joe wore several layers of clothing. He also needed to wear a special pressurized suit to prevent his body from exploding and his blood from boiling. The danger of this happening was caused by the low-pressure conditions of space, where very little air exists. In space, pressure inside the body is much greater than the pressure from the outside atmosphere, which pushes against the body. This can happen starting at an altitude of 18,900 meters, 62,000 feet, which is known as Armstrong's limit. Despite all the measures taken to keep Joe safe, he experienced pain in his right hand when the pressurized glove he wore developed a leak and lost pressure. Let's continue to follow Joe in his amazing fall through the atmosphere. He was being pulled by gravity back home to Earth. As he fell, his body accelerated, reaching speeds of over 965 kilometers, 600 miles per hour. Some experts say he even may have broken the sound barrier. If so, he was the only person ever to break the sound barrier unaided or unprotected by any sort of craft for over 50 years. Math Minute. When Joe jumped from his high-altitude balloon at 31,000 meters, he was in a free fall for 4 minutes and 36 seconds before his parachute opened. He was at 5,500 meters when the chute opened. What was his average speed in meters per second during his free fall? Answer: about 95 meters per second. After falling for 16 seconds, Joe's small 1.8 meter, 6-foot diameter drogue parachute opened and slowed his fall. A drogue parachute is elongated and thinner than a regular parachute. This design stops the parachute from being torn apart during high-speed falls from high altitudes. Joe fell for another 4 minutes and 36 seconds before his main parachute opened, allowing him to drift slowly down to Earth. Joe had proven that a human could survive in near space-like conditions outside a spacecraft or aircraft after an emergency escape. You might ask whether Joe was really in space. Technically speaking, he was not. Space really does not have a well-defined border. It's not like stepping across the border of one country into another. The atmosphere just keeps getting thinner and thinner as you move away from Earth. However, many scientists define the border of space, called the Kármán line, as 100 kilometers, 62 miles, above Earth. So it would appear that Joe didn't actually reach true outer space. Nonetheless, he was high enough to experience conditions similar to those in space. And remember, he wasn't even inside a spaceship. Joe's daring jump set an altitude record for a parachute jump that remained unbroken until 2012. Joe sets another record. Joe was more than a guy who jumped out of balloons. He was also a highly skilled pilot with a love of flying that began early in his life. Born in 1928 in Tampa, Florida, Joe spent his early years growing up around Orlando, Florida. You might say he was obsessed with flying. He read everything he could find about flying and pilots, and he built many model airplanes. Wowzer! Felix Baumgartner, an Austrian skydiver, broke joekittinger's records for altitude and speed in 2012. Felix jumped out of a gondola 39,045 meters, 128,100 feet above Earth's surface. His free fall lasted for 4 minutes and 20 seconds, 16 seconds less than Joe's jump in 1960. He reached a speed of 1,342 kilometers, 833.9 miles per hour, about 97 kilometers, 60 miles per hour faster than the speed of sound. Joe and Felix worked together for years to prepare Felix for the jump. Joe watched from the control room, speaking to Felix during his journey back to Earth. Joe spent his teenage years hanging around a local airport and persuading pilots to give him free plane rides. By age 17, he had flown his first solo flight. Joe joined the U.S. Air Force after 2 years of college and soon became a test pilot, flying experimental and fighter aircraft. Do you know? The city of Orlando, Florida, built a park by the airport where Joe used to hang out, so other kids could have a place to watch planes take off and land. The park was named Colonel joekittinger Park. In 1955, Joe went from piloting airplanes to piloting balloons. He had made several high-altitude balloon flights and balloon jumps before his record-setting flight and jump in 1960. In one of those earlier jumps, Joe's drogue chute opened only 2 seconds after he jumped from the gondola, instead of after 16 seconds as it was supposed to. A cord from the chute wrapped around his neck and sent him into a near-fatal downward spiral. Joe became unconscious during the violent spinning, but luckily, his safety chute opened automatically and slowed his fall, allowing him to float safely down to Earth. You might think that this experience would have caused Joe to think about changing his career, but it didn't. He stuck with the project and made other flights, which led to his record-setting balloon flight and jump. After setting the world record for his high-altitude parachute jump, Joe went to Vietnam and flew combat missions. He served 3 combat tours during the war and flew a record-breaking 483 flight missions. In 1972, on his 483rd flight, his luck ran out when he was shot down. That became his last flight in combat. Joe was able to eject from his crashing jet and parachute safely to Earth. Unfortunately, he landed behind enemy lines, 30 miles northwest of Hanoi, North Vietnam, and was captured immediately. For the next 11 months, Joe was a prisoner of war held by his captors in the infamous Hanoi Hilton prison. Joe was placed in solitary confinement for 30 days. During his time as a prisoner, Joe occupied his mind by planning every detail of a balloon flight around the world, a flight that no human had accomplished. Think about it. Imagine being a prisoner for nearly a year and not being allowed to be around other prisoners. What would you do during your time in confinement to keep your mind occupied? More records for Joe. After retiring from the Air Force in 1978, Joe continued his work in aeronautics. He also added to his other record-setting accomplishments by flying lighter-than-air balloons. He entered many competitions around the United States. 5 years after his retirement from the Air Force, Joe set yet another record. He flew a helium-filled balloon from Las Vegas, Nevada, to Franklinville, New York, a distance of 3,220 kilometers, 2,000 miles. It took him 72 hours to fly the record-setting distance. In 1984, at the age of 56, Joe decided to go for another record. No one had flown a balloon alone across the Atlantic Ocean. All the more reason for Joe to try it. On September 14, 1984, he took off from the state of Maine and drifted eastward. Almost 84 hours and 5,633 kilometers, 3,500 miles later, he landed his balloon in Italy. Joe had set another record. Conclusion. The dictionary defines a hero as someone who commits an act of bravery or who shows great courage when undertaking a task. Based on this definition, Joe is certainly a hero. Many heroes in fields like exploration become well known with their names appearing in the news and in textbooks. joekittinger is not a name that comes to mind in connection with space exploration. In this sense, Joe is an unsung hero. His early work with high-altitude balloons was not undertaken for the purpose of setting records, but rather for the benefit of pilots and astronauts. Despite being relatively unknown to the general public, Joe was recognized for his outstanding accomplishments. U.S. President Dwight D. Eisenhower awarded him the Harmon Trophy after Joe set the record for a high-altitude jump. Joe received many other awards and honors for his military, ballooning, and parachuting achievements, including the Silver Star, Distinguished Flying Cross, and Purple Heart. Joe is a man of extraordinary courage and bravery who made important contributions to the field of space exploration.